Let me begin by acknowledging we have here the chairman of our board of directors, John Olson, who also serves as chairman of the American Australian Association Limited here in Australia, as well as Craig Chapman, who's the chairman of the board of the American Australian Association Inc. in New York. And Craig did the quarantine. We're glad to have you down under here with us as well. The reason I take time to introduce them is because they're so integral into what we're doing here today. Many of you may know the Perth US Asia Center was launched just over 8 years ago based on some fundamental premises. Number one, the successful model of our sister center, the United States Studies Center, but perhaps more importantly, the understanding that you couldn't really understand Australia's relationship with the United States without understanding our shared interests, concern, values in this region, in the Indo-Pacific. The flip side, of course, is also true. You can't understand Australia's relationship with the region, with the Indo-Pacific, without understanding American investment, American partnership, American alliances. And in putting together this project, as Simon mentioned rightly, looking through the chapters that you've got in front of you, I think you'll find that you're hard-pressed to find any of them that don't underline those fundamental assumptions. My colleague Jeff Wilson, our director of research here, is contributed chapters on combating economic coercion, on attempts to entice the United States back into the TPP. Ambassador Keshup, I'm not sure whether that's your purview or not, but clearly that's a hope from us down here in Western Australia. Our new Canberra-based senior policy fellow, Hayley Channer, has done a wonderful chapter on infrastructure. John Lee did a wonderful chapter on supply chains. And so I think as you go through that report, you're going to find over and over again that assumption that grounded the leadership of the American Australian Association's actions really is holding true. If we want to understand the alliance, we need to understand the region. If we want to understand the region, we need to understand the alliance. And I think this report goes a long way in doing it. Now, having said that, the title of the report is State of the United States, an Evolving Alliance Agenda. We've got a great program for 3 different sessions focusing on the bilateral economic relationship, on the broader regional geoeconomic issues we're facing, on the security and alliance issues we're facing. But I thought we should also make sure that we kicked off with the first part of that, the State of the United States. When the United States Studies Center enticed Simon away from 20 years in Stanford, they brought with him a career of deep expertise in understanding American politics and in understanding polling. And so you'll note at the very outset of this report is a wonderful set of new polls conducted by the United States Studies Center that helps us get a bit of understanding of the state of the United States right now on some of these key issues. And so before we launch into the formal program and go through a series of panels, we thought we'd give Simon some time to kind of lay out some of those polls. If you've been picking up the Australian media in the last couple of days with a great article in the Fin Review and others, you have seen some of this. But Simon, why don't we turn it over to you to kind of outline the polls themselves. So, thanks.
Sure. Thank you. And indeed, look, embedded in the title, the State of the United States, as Gordon foreshadowed, is exactly that aspiration. Before we get to the alliance agenda, I think it's incumbent on us to understand what are the domestic political constraints or enablers back in the US, particularly after this rather torrid time the United States has been through politically, with the experience of COVID and the transition to a new administration, wafer-thin majorities for this administration in Congress. I don't think we can meaningfully start to talk about what's likely to come and be possible through the alliance, unless we're totally mindful of that. And indeed, large parts of the Australian government are devoted to trying to figure that stuff out. Our team in the embassy and analysts back here in various parts of the government as well, that is very much their mission. And indeed, we want to contribute to that as well. And as Gordon so kindly mentioned, it's an honour to be able to bring some of my professional expertise to bear on that, one of the most pleasing parts of the job of running the United States Studies Center. And we can only do it with the support of the board. I've pitched these survey projects every year to the board, and my board chairman, Mark Bailey, here, and Heather Smith is here, and I'm going to forget. There's Ian Sains is here. Thank you for being here. And John Olson, of course, also serves on our board. So important that we have their support in undertaking ambitious projects like this, so thank you. With that, can I drive the slide deck off this clicker? Yeah, thank you, okay. Okay. Well, there's our agenda for today. We might come back to that in just a moment. We'll get into this first set of findings, and that is, how does the US domestic, as I said, what's going on in US politics that's going to allow some of the things that are in Australia's interest to happen, or perhaps to be harder work than we might initially expect. So for a couple of years now, the United States Study Center has been asking a set of standard questions about American foreign policy and foreign policy priorities of the mass public. So these are mass opinion surveys in the United States. And for this first set of data, and we've got a few instances like this that I'll show you, we've got questions that we've asked in July of 2019. We asked again just before the US presidential election, and then again just after, in January, just after President Biden was inaugurated. And so those three columns in each panel there refer to the findings from each wave of those surveys, if you will. And the key takeaway from this is that, look, it's been a truism of American politics that there is a pretty strong bipartisan consensus on the urgency of the China question. But that has just accelerated like crazy among Trump voters, to the point where what used to be a reasonably similar distribution of beliefs about China across partisan groups, between President Trump's rhetoric tying China explicitly to the COVID pandemic, and then the election loss itself, Trump voters just accelerated away from the rest of their fellow Americans, hardening in their attitudes towards China. In a few instances, you'll find Democratic voters also more willing to say things like, China's influence on the United States is negative. America is too economically dependent on China. That China is unfriendly or even an enemy of the United States. Look at that. After the election, 92% of Trump voters describe China that way, as unfriendly or an enemy. That's up to 71% among Biden voters, and 72% across the United States will use either of those two labels to describe China. Saying the United States and China are in a Cold War, or indeed that China has overtaken the United States as the world's technological leader. There's much more, that falls short of a majority in the United States, but hovering close to it, around in the 40% mark for each partisan group. But yet again, there's a case where so much of the opinion change in the United States is driven by Trump voters. And that's no surprise. As I said before, the way that particularly as COVID arrived in the United States, and the way President Trump talked about its origins, and then of course the election loss itself. So we enter the post-election period, the first months of the Biden administration. So the consensus is true. Yes, there is not a lot of disagreement about China and its importance as a foreign policy priority, and indeed negative attributions after negative attribution across the board. But the extent to which that is so prominent among Trump voters is particularly striking. Isolationism, though, has also picked up now. It's not at levels where I think there's anything perhaps especially to be concerned about. It is tracking, this is a measure, you ask people, America would be better off if, and this sort of very folksy form of words, if we just stayed at home and didn't concern ourselves with problems in other parts of the world. It's folksy because that question has been asked in the American public since about 1950. But our measures of it over the last couple of years, these numbers are aren't particularly alarming relative to that long historical set of measures we've got. But what, again, is really eye-popping is the way you've got this quite large partisan differential. Only 28% of Biden voters will say that after the election, but it's up to 60% among Trump voters. And that suggests there is some partisan tension there. And where does that become relevant? That becomes relevant when it goes to Congress. Right, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. We've got to set all this public opinion data against these wafer-thin margins in Congress, and the possibility that these things might break down in Congress or be subject to some wedging as congressional politics heats up towards the midterms. That's where we're sort of going with some of this. We also asked Americans to rate their foreign policy priorities. We gave them 3 foreign policy goals. 1, working with allies to stand up to China is dealing with global climate change, or promoting democracy in other nations. And for each of those, we asked them to rate how important they were, very, fairly, not much, and so on. Of the 2 top ratings, if we just look at how many Trump voters, and across all categories, we just pick off the very or fairly. Well, China, again, wouldn't be a surprise given the earlier data I just showed you. 93% of Trump voters say working with allies to stand up to China is very or fairly important. There's not much difference there. Biden, 88% of Biden voters say that. But for Biden voters, nothing trumps climate change, really. 97% of Biden voters say dealing with global climate change is very or fairly important, and you can see the partisan tension there. Only 30% of Trump voters make that assessment. We've got some real partisan daylight there when it comes to dealing with climate change as a foreign policy priority. Less love for democracy promotion. That is unambiguously sort of not as important as the other 2 for both partisan groups. And we can then, for each individual respondent, we can do a few things. We can look at how often did climate change actually was unambiguously the top or equal top issue. And that's on the left-hand side of that table, and that's table 1 in the report at page 13. Again, you see this intense partisan differentiation here. For Biden voters, for 2/3 of them, climate is top or equal top on their priorities. That's only the case for 8% of Trump voters. For 83% of Trump voters, China is top or equal top. But critically, for Biden voters, China, working with allies to stand up to China, is top or their equal top priority of the 3 we gave them, for only about a quarter of them, for only about 26%. So again, some real partisan colour there with climate. Again, just more evidence of how climate just pops to the top of the Democratic rank and file when you ask them to list their priorities. Yes, China's important when you give it to them sort of on its own, but once you start stacking the priorities up against one another, it's so clear that climate will, if it ever came to a trade-off, at least among Democratic rank and file, that climate dominates just working with allies to stand up to China as a foreign policy priority. And that's, again, I think that's an important set of context to have in mind when you think about how this is going to percolate through the American political system, how much foreign policy can be made independently of public opinion, and a lot can and does, and how much you've got to go to Congress and hold coalitions together and get budgets and perhaps on occasion even have to get support across the aisle for certain things. Right, and so on the right-hand side of this graph, I want to show you one thing that did get a little bit of media attention over the weekend. Surveys are cheap talk. I will cop to that at the outset. But what we asked people to do here, we gave people the choice of buying a cell phone, a mobile phone, or a mobile phone not made in China, or a mobile phone made in China. But we varied the cost of the not made in China phone. It got more expensive successively. And we randomly changed the price premium. How much are you willing to pay for a product not made in China? And again, for Trump voters, if there's no difference in price, 100% of them will take the not made in China phone. It's not often in survey research you see 100%, but there it is. But as the premium of decoupling, frankly, of not buying a ubiquitous piece of technology for that to be a not made in China product, as that price premium goes up, support does fade away. But look at these numbers in absolute terms. Yes, they slope down, as you'd expect. The laws of supply and demand are working. But even at a $500 price premium, roughly 3/4 of Americans say they prefer the not made in China phone. Among Biden voters, that's a little lower, down at 60%, and among Trump voters, that's as high as 90%, even at the $500 price point. And we've hit these data a little hard. That's not just because Biden voters are typically, you might say, well, they've got less income, they're more price sensitive. It's actually, it seems to withhold any further analysis about looking at those income effects. But it does show to us that at least, and again, perhaps talk on surveys is cheap. If push came to shove and that $500 did have to leave someone's wallet, would we see these same numbers? But it does suggest, at least the public opinion here suggests that America is perhaps willing to bear the costs of competition with China, if particularly going right down to a ubiquitous everyday piece of technology. So that was a revealing piece of data to get. But again, the overall levels are high, but the partisan gradient is noteworthy. There is a 30-point difference by the time you get up to $500 between Trump voters and Biden voters. The last thing I want to show you from the public opinion data is that we can't underestimate the depth of partisan animus and the difficulty that means for getting anything bipartisan. The COVID relief package went through the Senate on a strict party vote. There was no Republican at the end of the day voting for final passage, and the Democrats had to make a few concessions too. And it need only be one senator when you need all of them. And so Joe Manchin insisted on minimum wage being taken out. Now, a lot stayed in that package, but we can't, I think it's really hard for Australians, I think, to understand the depths of this. So the way we thought we'd help Australians understand this was to do the following exercise. We surveyed some Australians and we asked them to do the same exercise as we put before our American respondents, and that is to rate the parties on a 0 to 100 thermometer scale, where 0 is cold and you don't like the party, and 100 is warm and hot and you really like the party, and 50 is lukewarm, you're in the middle. And in the United States, Biden voters give a 13 rating to the Republicans. They give an 80 to their own party, so a party difference of 57. Trump voters only rate the Republican Party 63. That's informative in and of itself. But look at that. The median rating of the Democratic Party from a Trump voter is 5, for a partisan gap of 58. That's what negative partisanship looks like. Whatever we've got in Australia, it's not remotely close. The partisan gaps we're seeing in Australia on exactly the same sort of task are on the order of 20 points smaller. Labor Party voters will rate the coalition parties at 38, their own party at 76. Coalition voters give their own parties an 80 rating, but they give the Labor Party 46. That's just a tad below lukewarm. For a difference of 34. Trump voters are giving the out party a rating of 5. Coalition voters in Australia give the out party a rating of 46. Whatever you think about partisanship in Australia at the moment, it's got nothing on the United States. And this is the key thing about American public opinion at this moment. It has never been like this since, you've probably got to go back to 1890, and I'd suggest we're even starting to head back to almost even earlier, back closer in time to the Civil War, to find a point where being a partisan in the United States increasingly means the following: not that I just like my side of politics, but I dislike the other side of politics. That is a belief now that is not just among people who are political junkies. That is in mass opinion data now. Right? And that sets, I think we've got to calibrate expectations now about what's possible out of this Congress as a result, and think through what that might mean for Australian national interest, what it is we'd like to see come through the US Congress, what is realistic in this environment? And that's where we turn to the assessment of what might come through Congress. This is a graph to show you just how thin the margins are. 2020 is highlighted in the middle. it's 50-50 in the US Senate, and Biden has a House of Representatives where the incumbent president hasn't had such a narrow margin for a long, long time. An incoming president, yes, on paper they have the House, they have the Senate, but there is no room, very little margin for error. And around the US Study Centre, our assessment is, and this is where I think there's an implication for Australia, a couple of implications for Australia that we flesh out in the discussion. Number one, meaningful climate change policy, I think, is not going to happen domestically in the United States. It will be executive orders around things like that Biden's already announced, around things like the federal government will buy more electric vehicles, the EPA will get some teeth back, but legislating aggressive targets through the Congress, it's hard to see that happening. I don't see that getting through the House given the narrowness of those margins. Now, what does that mean? I think that throws, putting the pieces together here, it throws the focus back on the international arena as a way to satisfy this deep policy appetite among the Democratic base for some action here. Part of the US being a responsible and earning its global reputation back will be through climate change statements and actions in the international domain, because it's very hard to see degrees of freedom for the Democrats to move aggressively on that through the Congress. And that's something, obviously Australia will be keeping a very close eye on. We further assess that, look, if you put the two positions of the governments up beside each other at the moment, some of the early statements from the Biden White House against, for instance, I just next door, the speech that Minister Taylor gave late last year, I believe it was, the phrase technology not taxes, that's much more in the Australian lingo on this issue, is actually not an unreasonable characterisation, I think, of where the US system will land on this. And you heard the ambassador speak about, I think, the way that the two governments are likely to charge ahead on technologies and research partnerships and really getting going on that. I think that's much more doable and fertile terrain given our assessment of the lay of the land politically, both domestically in both countries, frankly, and where will be a place this can land in a meaningful way. The flip side is things where we can see the US Congress agreeing in ways that are favourable to US interests, to Australian interests rather, and that is around defence budgets. We assess that, it will be possible to build off that sense of urgency of the China challenge to link a lot of the spending being proposed around defence, and indeed, as we opened up today, this linking it to innovation and renewing the American economy. We expect that there will be majorities for that, and in both chambers, and inside those majorities, this is where it does get a little more nitty-gritty, and we'll have more to say on this in our third session today, implications for the defence budget, and in particular, dedicated funding for more spending in the Indo-Pacific and the forms that might take. But when you look at the big picture around American public opinion and the urgency of the China challenge, there is enough there, more than enough there, we assess, to build a majority and you could even lose some Democratic votes and get enough Republicans over when it comes to a defence budget. And so that's the other assessment we make and lay out in here. Finally, the last one would be infrastructure spending, but the list is getting short now. There is very little else in this very aggressive domestic policy agenda that Biden has put forth that we see being able to get through the US Senate. But after COVID relief, infrastructure spending, and a defence budget with a boost perhaps for presence in the Indo-Pacific from the United States. Those are perhaps two things where are very much in Australia's interest that we see those happen. There's some takeouts from our political lay of the land. The good news for Australia, I think, is our assessment around this appetite for meeting the China challenge comprehensively, for this linkage between Build Back Better, the domestic recovery program for the Biden administration, and explicitly linking that to foreign policy goals. That's extremely encouraging and enjoys bipartisan support in the United States. The devil will be in the details to see how much that translates into kit and presence in the Indo-Pacific.